Hi, I'm Robert Veal from Limelight Arts Travel, and I'm delighted to share a small list of books and films for people who are traveling on Limelight Arts Travel's tours to Sicily. If you've just found this video on YouTube and you're not traveling with Limelight Arts Travel, well, that's fine. I hope you find some interesting suggestions here in our little list. I've divided the list into 4 different sections, and to start with, of course, a guidebook. Now, if you're traveling with Limelight Arts Travel, you'll have an expert tour leader, so you don't really need a guidebook, but I know that lots of people like to read for themselves to get the summary histories, the descriptions of art and architecture and things like that. And there's no better cultural guidebook for Sicily than the Blue Guide. This is part of a series, of course, for the thinking traveller, if you like. If you've got a serious interest in history, culture, and the arts, then the Blue Guides are certainly the most comprehensive, the most detailed of the guides available, and they assume a level of intelligence in the reader, not an expert level, but an interested, intelligent person. So highly recommended. Let's have a look firstly at some primary sources of ancient history. Now, you may have studied ancient history. A lot of people who travel to Sicily have somewhere in their past studied ancient history, and you might be familiar with some of these texts already. If you're not, and if you haven't studied ancient history, don't worry, you don't have to read thousands and thousands of pages of text. I've got here 3 key texts. They're all available online, and you can hone in on those online resources, places like the Perseus project, which was an aim to digitize as many classical literary sources as possible. So a key text in our understanding of ancient Greek Sicily and even ancient prehistory in Sicily is undoubtedly Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War, and specifically Book 6, where he deals with the so-called Sicilian expedition in the 5th century BCE, and prior to the actual description of the horrific events which take place all around the island, but particularly at Syracuse. He gives a description of Sicily as it was in the time before the Greeks arrived, and this is one of the most famous descriptions of, if you like, prehistoric Italy. Again, looking particularly at Syracuse, Plutarch, who is a Greek historian, but is writing in the 1st century CE of the Roman Empire. And he writes a series of what are called parallel lives, where he compares illustrious Greeks to notable Romans, comparing the qualities of the 2 civilizations. And he looks particularly at the Roman consul Marcellus, who was responsible for bringing Greek colonization and Greek rule in Sicily in the ancient world to an end. And there's a wonderful section in the chapter on Marcellus, which looks at his other exploits as well, that specifically compares Marcellus and Archimedes, who is killed during the Roman siege, I should say, of Syracuse, that marks the very end of the ancient Greek period. For an account of criminality in Sicily, and this is the first really literary account that presents Sicily as being a place of dark crime and corruption. There's no better text than Cicero's stunning trial script, the oration that he gives against the corrupt Roman governor Verres. Verres had been sent by Rome to Sicily to rule. Instead, he plunders the island, extorting the citizens, pinching artworks, the most famous sculptures from the most famous temples, and in other ways destroying the civilization there. So Cicero's trenchant speech against Verres is a classic in terms of legal texts, but it's also wonderful insight to Sicily, or how the Romans saw ancient Sicily at that particular time in the 1st century CE. Moving on now to general history, a couple of broad books, and I'm covering mythology and memoir in all of this, so mixing up a little bit other things. Recently, I read a book that was published in 2010 by Jeremy Dummett called Syracuse City of Legend, or City of Legends. Its title suggests it's about the legends, but it's about much more than that, and indeed it's about the ancient history particularly, but also the medieval, and a short chapter on the modern history of Syracuse. Although it focuses on Syracuse, which is certainly one of Sicily's most historic cities, the understandings and the scope of Dummett's book goes well beyond sort of the physical confines of Syracuse itself, and speaks more generally about Sicily. It also contains some of those texts, some of those primary sources that I referred to earlier are reproduced in Dummett's book, but he also relies very heavily on them in his chapters, particularly on the ancient Greek and ancient Roman periods in Syracuse's history. A much loved memoir, A Year in Sicily, if you like, is Mary Taylor Sametti's On Persephone's Island. And it's a reflection about Sicily and what Sicily is like as a place, written from the perspective of a visitor, an outsider. So it's very useful for us who are also visitors. And specifically, Sametti considers and thinks about the parallels between Sicily as one sees it today and ancient Greek Sicily. So hence the title of reference to the myth of Persephone and her being abducted and taken to the underworld, one of dozens, quite literally, of Greek and then later Roman myths that are set on the island of Sicily. So part memoir, part history, part an essay about Sicily, with many references to the ancient past there. Looking specifically at the medieval period, I'd like to recommend two books to you. One is an absolute classic, and don't be fooled by this small image here on the slide. This book is thick as a brick, and in fact it's actually two books that are put together. The Normans in Sicily, it's called, by John Julius Norwich, Lord Norwich, who is kind of like the godfather of cultural tourism. He started a company called Jules Verne. He was a member of the House of Lords, and I don't know where he found the time, but he also wrote about the Byzantine Empire, and specifically the Norman conquest and kingdom of Sicily. So the Normans in the south is the first part, and the kingdom in the sun, the second part, which documents firstly the Norman conquest of Sicily in the 10th and then 11th centuries particularly, and then the kingdom of Sicily, the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which is the first unified kingdom and very important in Sicily's history in the 12th century and early 13th century in particular. It is a long book and it's a big read, but particularly the second part of that, The Kingdom in the Sun, about the Norman kingdom, is absolutely teeming with insight. Also teeming with insight is Jackie Alio and Louis Mendele's book on the peoples of Sicily. And I've paired these two up because the sense of Sicily being a multicultural island, that over the centuries people came from many different places, and layer upon layer of civilization and culture is to be seen there. It is particularly in the Middle Ages, immediately after the Arabs and the attempted Byzantine conquest, when the Normans come to rule, that this sense of multicultural Sicily is perhaps at its peak. And so in a very erudite book, Jackie is a guide who works in Palermo, who I've had the pleasure of working with on many occasions, but she's written this book which investigates Sicily from the point of view of its many cultures and the many influences. Highly recommended. You'd have to order that book online or perhaps pick it up when you're in Sicily. Of course, for many people, Sicily is synonymous with organized crime and the Mafia. And the first thing I'll say about this is that if this is your perception of Sicily, then you certainly need to broaden your horizons. But I know that the phenomenon of organized crime, its meaning, the way it's permeated society, and the way it reflects Sicily's unique history is of great interest to many people. So I've put two books here that I think are particularly good. One is very well known to Australian readers, of course, and that's Peter Robb's 1995, I think it was, Midnight in Sicily. I well remember reading this book just a few months before I took my first ever group to Sicily, and I think I almost cancelled the trip after reading sometimes a terrifying account written by a novelist, so with a flamboyant style, some would say an exaggerated an account of some aspects of it, but a very readable book, not just about the Mafia, about Sicily and the Sicilian mindset. Perhaps more scholarly and measured and very, very interesting is John Dickey's book Cosa Nostra, which traces the development of the mafia from the last half of the 19th century with vegetable sellers in Palermo and middlemen, standover men, and then the spectacular growth of the mafia, its exportation to the United States and other places, and also its more recent manifestations there. Neither of these books is particularly happy, but they are very, very insightful. Looking now at some fiction, I'll start off with two classics of 18th century historic fiction. Now, one of them is very, very well known, and that's Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's The Leopard, which was published posthumously in the 1960s. Tomasi was the son or the descendant of a noble Sicilian family, and he writes fictionally of Don Fabrizio, who was one of the last barons of Sicily. It's set in the 19th century, just as Sicily is being unified, and it looks at Sicilians' resistance to change, and particularly the Sicilian nobility, this aristocracy that goes right back to the Normans, who I mentioned earlier, and is slow to change and ultimately rejects this modern idea of the unified Italy and Sicily's place within it. It's not necessarily the best written novel that you'll ever read, but it plays an important role of firstly explaining Sicily to the Italians. Initially, this is part of its popularity. Later to foreigners when the book is translated, and also the film is made, of course, of the book, but also of explaining Sicily to the Sicilians themselves, and this rather mixed legacy, this pride in the nobility who are sort of a distinctly Sicilian aspect of the island's history and its culture, but at the same time have been undoubtedly a drag, economic and social drag on Sicilian society more generally. Similar sorts of concerns, but a completely different perspective, comes in Dacia Mariana's The Silent Duchess, set again in the aristocratic milieu, but this time in the 18th century, a woman who has undergone some sort of trauma and is mute, but observes life as a woman and the huge unfairness of this male-dominated society. So Mariani is known among Italian writers as being distinctly feminist in his take, and so I thought I'd put these two up just to counterbalance, if you like, Tomasi da Lampedusa's very male-oriented account of Sicily in the historical past, in the recent historical past. Looking towards fictional works that are set in the 20th century, of course, a very dramatic time in Sicily and Italy's history, I've selected two books set in the 1940s and 50s. One of them, Conversations in Sicily by Elio Vittorini, set in the fascist period. Very interesting for Sicily because, of course, the fascists took on the Mafia and were largely successful, but they also brought with them a repressive, authoritarian kind of reign, which rather violently put the Sicilians in their place. The Day of the Owl is a detective book by Leonardo Sciascia, a well-known Sicilian writer, a short book often regarded as one of his best works. It's a detective fiction work where the detective himself becomes the story or the subject of the investigation, and again, it's set in the 1940s. If those all are rather heavy, then a lighter series, which was equally revealing about Sicily and modern-day Sicily, is a well-known one, and that's Andrea Camilleri's Inspector Montalbano series. And the book I've got illustrated here is the first, and many think the best book in the series, The Shape of Water. So some of you might have seen the television series. The novels are unchallenging as a read, but absolutely full of local colour and local insight. Looking very briefly at film now, some of these films you'll have to wait for a film festival to go to cinema and have a look. Things like The Leopard, the wonderful still that I'm showing you now with Burt Lancaster and Claudia Cardinale in the famous ballroom scene. That's shown every now and again at art house cinemas. Other works are less easy to get, perhaps some bad versions on YouTube that you might find, that is poorly reproduced versions, I should say. But have a look for these if they're coming out in a film festival, or perhaps you've got access to them online. So the film version, of course, of The Leopard is the way that many English speakers came to know this beautiful book about Sicily. Luchino Visconti, who is later known for films like Death in Venice and rather flamboyant, opulent filmmaking, actually cuts his teeth on a neo-realist film called La Terra Trema, The Earth Quakes, quite literally, which is set in a very poor fishing village at the very end of World War II. The film was made in 1946 and attempts to modernize in terms of industrial relations, the fishing industry at the time. It's still very much medieval, and its structure and its economy, and the terrifically poor fishermen are exploited as poor Sicilians have been for centuries. And so it's class warfare, a very grim depiction of life in Sicily for ordinary working people, the fishermen and their families, but nevertheless a great film and one of Visconti's early masterpieces, very highly regarded. Also set in post-World War II Sicily, this time the film made in 1950, uses the island of Stromboli to present Ingrid Bergman, who is a refugee from Northern Europe. She's a displaced person at the end of World War II, and she finds herself on the very remote Aeolian island of Stromboli, really, a volcano stuck out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and deals with the difficulty that she has integrating with this harsh insular society here. So a great movie, made perhaps more famous or infamous because of the romantic relationship which emerged between Ingrid Bergman, the star, and Roberto Rossellini, the director, during the making of the film. And then to finish off, a film which was made about one of the most notorious episodes of the Mafia in Sicily, and this was the murder of the judges Borsellino and Falcone, the horrific murders that took place in the 1980s in Sicily. And the film, Excellent Cadavers, based on a book, again, a rather serious topic, but it is a great exploration of this particular topic. So look, a short selection of mainly books, but also there are a few films to get you in the mood and to get your mind in the place to explore the wonderful island that is Sicily. Thank you very much, and happy reading.